All right, so today we're really diving deep into something I think we all care about, especially as we get a little older.
Yeah.
It's brain health, and
Right.
specifically what we can do to possibly lower our risk of dementia.
Right.
We've been going through some fascinating research,
Absolutely.
and it turns out that staying physically active, but also keeping our minds sharp, like really engaged, can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Huge.
So let's break this down and see what's most important for us to kind of take away from all this.
Yeah. One of the things that just jumps out right away from this research is how much of a connection there is between, regular physical activity, like actually getting out there and moving,
Uh-huh.
and a lower risk of dementia, especially for seniors. We're looking at numbers like a 22 to 28% reduction,
Uh-huh.
depending on, how intense the activity is and how often you're doing it.
Yeah.
And that's pretty big.
Yeah, that's not insignificant.
No, it's
No.
not. And, to put that into context, like some studies that look at, certain medications, they show similar or sometimes even smaller risk reductions.
Oh, wow.
So it really emphasizes how powerful these lifestyle changes can be,
Mm.
right? Just making those changes in how you live your life.
Right, that's really something. 22 to 28%. That's pretty eye-opening. But it's not just about generally being active, right? It seems like the research points to specific types of activities
Right.
that are particularly helpful. Things like walking, cycling, swimming,
Yeah.
those classic aerobic exercises.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look even deeper into the research, it seems like aerobic exercises, things like running and swimming, have a really strong positive impact on how our brains function.
Mhm.
And the reason it's pretty interesting is mostly because they improve blood flow to the brain
Mhm.
and they reduce inflammation. So you can kind of think of it this way, right? A brain that's well-nourished, that doesn't have as much inflammation, it's just better equipped to keep those cognitive abilities sharp
Yeah, that makes sense.
as we get older, right?
Right.
And that number, that 22 to 28%, that comes from looking at a lot of research.
Okay.
It's basically analyzing, how different levels of physical activity are linked to dementia rates over time.
So basically, by getting our heart rate up, we're not only feeling better physically,
Right.
but we're actually setting the stage for a healthier brain later on.
Exactly.
It's much more impactful than I originally thought.
Yeah, it is.
But how does all this increased blood flow and less inflammation, how does it actually translate into like real improvements in our thinking and memory?
Well, that's where it gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
The research shows that physical activity can actually make the volume of both gray matter and white matter in certain parts of the brain,
Hmm.
it can actually make it bigger.
Really?
And we're talking about key areas here, like the hippocampus.
Oh, right.
That's the part of the brain that's super important for memory, but also for spatial navigation, like finding your way around.
Mm-hmm.
And it also affects areas that control what we call executive functions.
Okay.
Things like planning, making decisions, being able to focus.
So we're not just talking about slowing down any decline that might happen.
Right.
It's actually possible that we could be building up the structural strength of our brain.
That's what the research suggests, yeah.
Wow.
And there's this really interesting biological process that makes it happen.
Okay.
When we're physically active, it can trigger the release of something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
BDNF.
It's called BDNF for
Oh,
short.
BDNF.
And you can think of BDNF kind of like fertilizer for your brain cells.
Okay.
It helps them grow, it helps them survive, and it helps them function properly. And scientists, they've seen in a bunch of studies that when physical activity goes up, the levels of BDNF in the brain also go up.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a direct biological link there. More physical activity, more BDNF.
Mm.
And that can have these neuroprotective effects, meaning it helps protect the brain.
Fertilizer for brain cells. I like that. It really helps me picture what's going on.
Yeah.
One of the sources we were looking at really emphasized this idea of lifelong movement,
Right.
starting well before we reach our senior years, like even before the age of 50.
Yeah. And that's important because it raises the question about, how all the choices we make throughout our lives, how they add up and affect us.
Mm.
What the research is suggesting is that being active consistently throughout your entire life, especially those younger years before 50, it's really strongly tied to better brain health later on
Okay.
and a lower chance of cognitive decline. And this is true even for people who might have genes that make them more likely to develop conditions like Alzheimer's.
Mm.
So it really shows that building up that foundation of physical activity early on can create like a safety net,
Yeah.
a buffer against those age-related changes in our brains.
That's a powerful point. It's definitely encouraging to know that, it's probably never too late to start.
Right.
But it does sound like forming those habits earlier in life can really give us even more protection down the road
Exactly.
as we age.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the physical side of things,
Right.
but let's switch gears a bit and talk about the mental side.
Sure.
Just like we exercise our bodies, keeping our minds active plays a role in staying sharp
Yeah.
as seniors. So what about that?
Well, just like physical activity helps to, strengthen the actual physical structure and function of our brain, mental activities are super important for keeping our cognitive abilities strong and even improving them.
Wait.
And the research highlights that things like reading, doing puzzles, maybe that crossword isn't just a way to kill time after all. Playing card games, learning new skills, all of that can help slow down cognitive decline and potentially lower that risk of dementia.
We've all heard the advice to keep our minds active, but how does that actually work? How do these activities actually protect our brains?
Well, the key idea here is something called cognitive reserve.
Yeah.
It's like the brain's ability to handle damage or changes that happen with age without, really showing obvious signs of decline.
Okay.
And it's thought that cognitively stimulating tasks, things like crossword puzzles, chess, they help build up that reserve.
Hmm.
So even if some of those changes associated with dementia are happening in the brain, a higher cognitive reserve can help to kind of cushion the blow, and delay the onset
Yeah.
of those more noticeable symptoms.
It's almost like having extra brain power to handle any wear and tear that comes with age.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Now, what about staying socially connected?
Right.
That's not a purely mental activity in the same way as, like, a puzzle,
Right.
but it definitely involves our brains and emotions.
Absolutely, yeah. Social engagement is really important.
Yeah.
The research actually shows that staying in touch with friends and family, going to community activities, anything that keeps us connected socially
Yeah.
can actually lower the risk of dementia.
Really?
Yeah. And this is probably because of a few different reasons.
Okay.
Social interaction, it gives our brains a workout through
Uh-huh.
conversation,
Right.
through doing things together, through emotional engagement. And it also helps to prevent social isolation, which on its own has been linked to, not so good outcomes for our brains.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and we're social creatures by nature, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it seems like connection, it's not just good for our emotional well-being, but it actually directly benefits our brains.
It's amazing how everything's so interconnected.
Yeah.
One statistic from the research that really stood out to me was that people who engage in a lot of mental activity, they might actually postpone the onset of Alzheimer's by an average of 5 years,
Yeah, that's a significant amount of time.
especially when we're talking about folks who are over 80.
Right, right. And what's really remarkable is that even at that age, you can still potentially change the course of the disease just by staying mentally engaged. And some of the research also talked about being more aware of how we spend our free time.
Okay.
So like instead of passively watching TV for hours, maybe try doing something more active, like using a computer or pursuing hobbies that involve learning new things or having those stimulating conversations. The idea is that when you're actively engaging with information and ideas, it's a better workout for your brain than just passively being entertained.
Right. It's a difference between just filling time and actually nourishing our minds.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we've talked about the separate benefits of physical activity and mental activity.
Right.
But the big takeaway from all this research seems to be that they're not two separate things. They actually work together and maybe even boost each other's positive effects.
Absolutely. That's what the research really strongly suggests.
Yeah.
There's a synergy there. Regular exercise, it doesn't just improve the structure and function of the brain directly, through that increased blood flow and BDNF release,
Right.
but it also helps manage other big risk factors for dementia, things like obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes. And then at the same time, all those cognitively stimulating activities and social interactions, those are crucial for building and keeping that cognitive reserve strong. So when you combine both types of activities, physical and mental, you get the best protection against cognitive decline as you get older.
Yeah.
It's not an either-or situation.
Right.
It's you got to do both
Both.
if you want to support your long-term brain health.
So it's about being proactive. It's about, making those choices that support a healthy brain,
Exactly.
both physically and mentally. And the research is really clear that these choices, they can make a real difference
They can.
in how our brains age.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes you think, with all this knowledge, what small changes could we make in our daily routines, that could really add up to something significant down the line?
Right.
What kind of mental or physical activities could we, really get into, make them a regular part of our lives?
Yeah.
That's something to consider, as we go about our days.
It is. It is.
Really think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, food for thought.
Food for thought, absolutely.